In the early 1930s, the streets of Harlem were alive with music, art, and dreams. Jazz clubs echoed with the rhythms of Duke Ellington, Langston Hughes' poetry filled the air, and a new generation of African Americans believed they were shaping the future of black identity in America. Yet behind the glow of the Harlem Renaissance, a harsher truth was taking shape. The Great Depression hit Harlem harder than most places in New York. Factories closed, jobs disappeared, and the once thriving community began to crumble under the weight of poverty and despair. Families who had come north seeking opportunity found themselves trapped in overcrowded tenements, struggling to pay rent or buy food. For many, daily life was a fight to survive. The promises of equality and freedom that had drawn so many to Harlem now felt distant. Businesses that lined 125th Street were mostly owned by outsiders, while the people who lived in the neighborhood worked long hours for low wages, if they could find work at all. The sense of pride and hope that once defined Harlem was fading, replaced by frustration and anger at a system that seemed designed to keep people down. Police patrols became more frequent, and tensions between officers and residents began to rise. Reports of mistreatment were whispered in the corners of cafes and on street corners, where men and women gathered to share news and grievances. Harlem was a community simmering under pressure, a place where one spark could easily ignite a fire. But even in those difficult times, Harlem's people never lost their spirit. There was still laughter in the nightclubs, still gospel songs in the churches, and still a belief, however fragile, that things could change. It was a neighborhood full of strength and history, standing proudly in the face of hardship. No one could have known that beneath that resilience, anger was quietly building. And soon, one small incident would unleash it all, shaking the city to its core and revealing the deep wounds of injustice that America had tried to ignore. If you want to learn more about the hidden stories that shaped our history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring forgotten voices back to life and keep history alive for everyone. In the years leading up to the Harlem Riot of 1935, everyday life for black residents in Harlem was marked by quiet struggles and unspoken resentment. Beneath the energy of the city, there was an invisible line dividing who was served, who was respected, and who was not. Harlem had been a promised land for many, families who had escaped the segregation of the South in search of dignity and opportunity. But what they found was a new kind of struggle, one shaped by economic hardship and the painful limits of inequality. Jobs were scarce, and when they did exist, they were rarely offered to black workers. White employees filled most of the better-paying positions, while black men and women were often left to take whatever work remained, janitorial jobs, domestic service, or long hours in poorly paid labor. Even the stores that lined Harlem's busy streets were reminders of that imbalance. Most were owned by white merchants who came into the neighborhood to make their living but showed little respect for the people who kept their businesses running. Many refused to hire local black residents, even as they relied on them as customers. For Harlem's residents, these daily injustices built a sense of deep frustration. People saw the unfairness everywhere, in the prices they paid, in the dismissive tone of store clerks, in the way they were followed or accused without reason. It was not just about money or work, it was about dignity. Each slight, each insult, was a reminder that even in the North, far from the Jim Crow laws of the South, equality was still out of reach. And then there were the police. In Harlem, officers were often seen not as protectors but as enforcers of an unjust order. Reports of mistreatment circulated through the community, stories of beatings, of arrests without cause, of humiliation on the street. Many residents began to feel that the law was something used against them, not for them. Young men learned to keep their heads down, to avoid attention, to walk quickly past a patrol car. Trust between the people and the police had eroded almost completely. Still, Harlem was a place of resilience. In the midst of hardship, there were moments of joy, music drifting from open windows, children playing on the sidewalks, couples dancing in crowded clubs where the sound of jazz drowned out the worries of the day. Yet beneath those moments, the pressure continued to build. Conversations in barbershops and churches began to turn toward injustice, toward the question of how much longer a community could endure being ignored and mistreated. Harlem in the 1930s was a neighborhood caught between two worlds, the dream of freedom and the reality of inequality. The pride that had once defined it was being tested by years of frustration. And as the Great Depression dragged on, the hope that things might change began to fade. It would take only one rumor, one spark, to turn that frustration into something far more explosive, a moment when Harlem's pain and anger would no longer be contained. The events that followed would shake New York City, forcing the nation to confront the uncomfortable truth about what happens when justice is denied for too long. It was a chilly afternoon in March 1935 when a small incident inside a Harlem department store set off a chain of events that no one could have imagined. On the surface, it seemed like an ordinary day. Children filled the sidewalks after school, laughter mixed with the sound of passing streetcars, and the rhythm of Harlem life continued as usual. But inside the S.H. Kress & Company store on 125th Street, something happened that would soon ignite an entire neighborhood. A 16-year-old boy named Lino Rivera walked into the store that day. Some say he had been curious, others say he reached for a small toy knife on display, a cheap trinket that any boy his age might have wanted to touch or hold. Whatever the truth, an employee accused him of theft. Words were exchanged, tempers rose, and in the tense atmosphere of that era, suspicion fell quickly and heavily on a young black teenager. Store security stepped in, and Rivera was taken to a back room. No one on the busy street outside knew what was happening inside. But soon, a crowd began to gather as whispers spread that a boy had been caught stealing. The rumor changed as it passed from one person to another, each telling adding something new. Some said the store clerk had struck him. Others claimed the police had been called and that the boy was being beaten. Then came the most dangerous story of all, that he had been killed. By the time word reached the street corners and cafes, the story had taken on a life of its own. The image of a dead child, another innocent victim of injustice, spread through Harlem like wildfire. People rushed toward the store, demanding answers. Mothers wept in disbelief, and men shouted for justice. The police arrived, trying to calm the crowd, but their presence only made things worse. Many in Harlem already distrusted the police, and now they believed those fears had been confirmed. Inside the store, Rivera was still alive. He had not been harmed and had already been released. But the truth no longer mattered. Once fear and anger take hold, facts become powerless against emotion. The crowd outside grew restless. Shouts echoed off the brick walls. A rock shattered one of the store's windows, and that sound, sharp and final, was like the breaking point of a long-suppressed pain. Soon, chaos spilled onto the streets. People who had lived quietly through years of inequality found themselves caught in a storm of rage they could no longer contain. Windows broke, alarms rang, and the tension that had been building for years finally erupted into violence. What began with a rumor about a boy and a toy knife became a symbol of something far greater, a neighborhood's cry against injustice, a moment when anger replaced patience. As night fell over Harlem, the streets burned with both fire and emotion. The air was filled with the sound of sirens and shattered glass, and the city realized too late that this was not just a riot, it was the eruption of years of silence, frustration, and pain. And though the truth about Lino Rivera would eventually come to light, the damage had already been done. Harlem had reached its breaking point, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. By the time the truth began to surface, it was already too late. Lino Rivera, the boy at the center of it all, was safe. He had not been beaten, and he had certainly not been killed. After a short scuffle inside the store, he had been quietly released to his mother and sent home. But the streets of Harlem did not know that. What they knew, or thought they knew, was that another young black life had been taken without reason. Rumors in Harlem traveled fast, carried by word of mouth, by anger, and by fear. By the time Rivera walked through his own front door, stories of his supposed death had already reached blocks away. People whispered about it in grocery lines, in barbershops, and on crowded stoops. It wasn't just a rumor anymore, it was a symbol, something that confirmed every fear the community had long held. The idea that a child could be killed over something as trivial as a toy knife struck at the heart of Harlem's collective pain. Parents thought of their own children and what might happen if they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. The story tapped into something far deeper than one incident. It spoke to years of mistreatment, of lives undervalued, of injustice endured in silence. That evening, crowds began to gather outside the S.H. Kress and Company store where the supposed killing had taken place. Men and women pressed against the glass, demanding answers. "What happened to the boy?" someone shouted. "Where is he?" another demanded. Police officers stood guard at the entrance, their presence only fueling the tension. No one inside seemed able, or willing, to explain the truth. To the crowd, that silence was proof enough. As the sun began to set, the mood on 125th Street grew darker. Voices rose from anxious murmurs to angry cries. Someone held up a makeshift sign calling for justice. Others clenched their fists, not out of malice, but out of exhaustion. Years of being ignored, of being disrespected, had brought them to this moment. Harlem's patience had worn thin. In the confusion, newspapers and bystanders added to the chaos. A few early reports mentioned the alleged death, printing it as fact before anyone could confirm the details. By the time corrections came later, the damage was done. The truth was too small to compete with the power of what people believed. As night fell, the streetlights flickered over an uneasy crowd. Police sirens echoed in the distance, and shopkeepers hurried to close their doors. The sense of outrage had taken on a life of its own. People weren't just angry about a rumor, they were angry about everything it represented. The story of Lino Rivera had become a spark, lighting the fuse on years of built-up resentment. Far from the chaos, the boy himself sat quietly at home with his mother, unaware that his name had become a rallying cry. In the following hours, Harlem would erupt into something no one could control. What had started as a misunderstanding turned into a mirror reflecting a much larger truth, that when a community's pain is ignored for too long, even a false story can feel more real than the facts. The crowd outside the store began as a restless gathering, a mix of anger, confusion, and disbelief. Men, women, and even children stood shoulder to shoulder on 125th Street, their faces tense, their voices low. They wanted answers, but none came. The store's windows reflected their frustration like a mirror, cold and unfeeling. Police officers lined the sidewalk, their expressions hard to read. Between the two sides hung a silence that grew heavier with each passing minute. Then someone shouted from the back of the crowd, a cry that carried over the noise of the city. Others joined in, their voices merging into a wave of protest. Chants filled the air, echoing down the narrow streets. It wasn't just about a single incident anymore, it was about everything that had built up over years of neglect and inequality. The people of Harlem had gathered not only to question what had happened to the boy but to make themselves heard after so long being ignored. Tension thickened as evening approached. The police ordered the crowd to disperse, but few listened. The line between protest and defiance began to blur. Hands gestured toward the store, where the supposed injustice had occurred. A woman shouted that the truth was being hidden. A man beside her pounded his fist against a lamppost, the metallic clang ringing through the crowd. What had started as anger was turning into something larger, something uncontrollable. Then it happened. A single object flew through the air, a bottle, maybe a stone, and crashed against a window. The sound of shattering glass was sharp, sudden, and final. In an instant, the street changed. The crowd surged forward, and the tension that had been building for hours broke loose. People shouted, others ran. Windows cracked, doors splintered, alarms screamed into the night. Shops that had stood for years along 125th Street became the first targets. Their windows glittered with broken glass under the streetlights. Some people stormed inside, not for greed, but for release, a desperate expression of rage that words could no longer contain. For them, this was not just about a store, it was about being seen, about striking back at a system that had never listened. Police reinforcements arrived, their whistles cutting through the chaos. They formed barricades, trying to hold the line as the crowd swelled in every direction. Smoke began to rise from somewhere down the street, no one knew where it started. The rhythm of Harlem that night was no longer jazz or laughter, but the sound of running footsteps, shouts, and breaking wood. By midnight, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. Fires flickered against the dark sky, casting long shadows on the faces of those who refused to go home. Some stood still, watching in disbelief at what their own hands, or the hands of their neighbors, had done. Others kept moving, as if carried by momentum, unable to stop even if they wanted to. The police struggled to restore order, but the city was already awake to a new reality. Harlem, long silenced by poverty and prejudice, had finally found its voice, loud, chaotic, and unstoppable. And though the flames would eventually die and the glass would be swept from the streets, the echoes of that night would linger, marking the moment when frustration turned into fury and history was forced to listen. As the night deepened, Harlem became a landscape of confusion and noise. Sirens screamed through the dark, echoing off the walls of tenement buildings, while the steady hum of the city gave way to the sharp rhythm of chaos. Streets that had been alive with music and conversation only hours before were now filled with broken glass, overturned carts, and the faint glow of scattered fires. The air hung heavy with tension, and the sound of approaching engines signaled that the police were coming in force. At first, there was a sense of disbelief among the crowd. Some thought the police might calm things down, that perhaps someone would finally explain what had happened and restore order. But as the first wave of officers arrived, it became clear that the city had chosen confrontation over conversation. They came in formation, moving through the streets with batons raised, shouting for people to clear the area. The crowd answered with shouts of its own, anger, frustration, and fear all blending into one sound that seemed to fill the night. The officers advanced methodically, their boots striking the pavement in rhythm. Lights from patrol cars swept across faces of people who had lived under suspicion for years, who now found themselves seen only as a threat. The tension between the two sides was electric, and it took only a single moment of panic to turn confrontation into violence. A bottle shattered near the front line. The police reacted instantly. Batons swung through the air, and the crowd scattered, running in every direction. Some fell, others tried to help them up before retreating into alleyways and doorways. Shouts turned to screams as the police pushed forward, determined to regain control of the streets. The roar of engines mixed with the sound of boots and breaking wood as officers forced their way through the crowd. In the chaos, the line between protester and bystander disappeared. Anyone still on the street became part of the unrest in the eyes of the police. Some people were pulled aside, questioned, or detained without explanation. Others tried to hide in doorways, hoping the worst would pass. The neighborhood that had once been a haven of culture and pride now felt like a battlefield, one where fear replaced music, and smoke hung in the place of laughter. Gunfire cracked in the distance, not steady, but scattered and uncertain. Whether fired into the air or toward the ground, it was enough to send waves of panic through the streets. Parents pulled their children inside. Lights flickered behind curtained windows as residents watched from their homes, too afraid to step outside but unable to look away. The police continued their sweep through the night, determined to restore order, but the cost was written across Harlem by dawn. The streets were littered with debris, shopfronts shattered, and the air smelled of burned wood and exhaustion. For the officers, it was another long night in the line of duty. For Harlem's residents, it was something much deeper, a reminder that when their cries for justice went unanswered, the city's answer came in the form of force. When morning came, the sun rose over a neighborhood changed forever. The smoke had cleared, but the memory of that night lingered in the cracks of the pavement and the silence of the people who walked it. Harlem had witnessed not just a clash of bodies, but a clash of truths, one between those who sought order and those who sought to be heard. And though the riot would end, the divide it revealed would not easily fade. When the first light of morning broke over Harlem, the streets were almost unrecognizable. The night's noise had faded into an eerie quiet. Smoke still drifted from the smoldering ruins of corner shops, and the sharp scent of burnt wood and broken glass filled the air. The city that had pulsed with life only a day before now looked as if it had stopped breathing. People stepped cautiously out of their homes, their faces weary, their eyes searching for signs of what had happened while they slept, or tried to. Along 125th Street, windows were shattered, doors torn from their hinges, and signs hung crookedly over what had once been busy storefronts. The destruction stretched for blocks, marking the path of the unrest that had swept through the neighborhood. In some places, store owners stood silently in front of their ruined shops, sweeping glass from the sidewalks, their expressions caught between disbelief and resignation. Others simply stared at the damage, knowing there would be no quick recovery. By mid-morning, the newspapers had their headlines ready. 3 people were reported dead, each a name that would soon be lost beneath the weight of the story itself. More than 70 others were injured, some struck during the clashes, others caught by chance in the chaos. Doctors and nurses worked through the night at Harlem Hospital, treating wounds and exhaustion alike. The waiting rooms were crowded, filled with whispers and questions no one could answer. City officials moved quickly to restore order, but the damage had already made its statement. Many of the businesses that had been attacked were owned by outsiders, merchants who had long profited from Harlem but rarely showed respect for its people. To those who had watched their neighborhood suffer under economic inequality, the shattered glass seemed symbolic, the breaking point of a relationship that had been strained for years. Yet even among the destruction, not everyone found satisfaction. Some residents looked upon the wreckage with sadness, knowing that their community, not just the shop owners, would bear the cost. In the days that followed, workers cleared debris from the streets, and children returned cautiously to the sidewalks where they once played. Conversations took on a quieter tone, heavy with reflection. Harlem had made headlines across the nation, but few outside truly understood what had happened there. The riot was not simply an outburst of anger, it was the culmination of years of silence, disappointment, and injustice. Behind closed doors, committees were formed to study the causes of the violence. Reports spoke of poverty, unemployment, discrimination, and neglect. Some officials described Harlem as a place ready to explode, a pressure cooker left too long without release. But for those who lived through it, the truth was simpler: people had grown tired of waiting to be treated fairly. By the week's end, Harlem began to move again. The streetcars resumed their routes, the markets reopened, and the rhythm of the neighborhood slowly returned. Yet the scars remained, not only in the buildings but in the hearts of those who had witnessed what desperation could become when hope runs thin. The riot had ended, but its echoes lingered. It forced the city to confront a reality it had long ignored, that beneath the bright lights and the music, Harlem was a community pushed to its limits. The broken windows would be repaired, the streets swept clean, but the memory of that night, and the reasons behind it, would not fade so easily. In the weeks that followed, New York City moved quickly to understand what had happened in Harlem. Officials formed committees, newspapers published editorials, and experts were called in to explain the unrest. But as the reports piled up, one truth began to emerge: this was not simply the result of one rumor or one night of anger. It was the eruption of something far deeper, something that had been building for years beneath the surface of the city. The official investigation spoke of poverty and neglect, of overcrowded homes and low wages, of a community forced to live with constant inequality. It described a neighborhood where opportunity had been promised but rarely delivered, where generations worked hard but saw little change. Harlem, the report concluded, had not burned because of a single spark, it had burned because it had been left in the dark for too long. City leaders were forced to confront what many already knew, that the divide between black and white New Yorkers was not just about race, but about access to jobs, to respect, to justice. The investigators called the riot a warning, a sign that without real change, the same anger could rise again elsewhere. It was a quiet admission that the city had failed its people, that it had looked the other way until the streets demanded to be heard. For Harlem's residents, the report offered little comfort. The stores would be rebuilt, the glass replaced, but the trust that had been shattered was not so easily repaired. People returned to their routines, but the memory of that night lingered, in the way neighbors spoke in hushed tones about what they had seen, in the glances exchanged when police passed by, in the heavy silence that followed whenever someone mentioned the boy whose name had started it all. Yet, even in the aftermath, there was resilience. Out of the destruction came new voices, community leaders, writers, and organizers, who began to speak louder, demanding change not through violence, but through persistence. Harlem, bruised but unbroken, continued to stand as both a symbol of pain and of strength. The Harlem Riot of 1935 became a mirror for America, reflecting not only the injustices of the past but the struggles that still lay ahead. It was a reminder that silence in the face of inequality always carries a cost, and that a nation cannot truly move forward until all its people are seen and heard. If you've stayed with the story until the end, thank you for taking this journey through history. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to keep these forgotten stories alive, and until next time, have a peaceful night and sleep well.